Okay, so recording has begun. Is that right? Tama. Okay. All right, so here's where we're at. Okay? Nasa 12.3 na tayo. So let me first, using the table of contents, show you guys what's happening. So nandito tayo sa chapter called Production, Labor Demand, Investment. Is there another one? And Labor Supply. Okay. So you've got, in addition to um, the intertemporal stuff that we learned before, now we are basically making it slightly more complicated by introducing the firm here. Okay. Then we're gonna do households. Okay. You guys can see the screen, right? That's being shared. Okay. Hope so. And that's being recorded right now. Yeah. And then finally here in 12.3, we're doing the financial intermediary here. Okay. So the purpose of this chapter, guys, is to move from an endowment economy where the income or the GDP is basically just a number, Y1, Y2, and now it's going to be because of the profit maximization decision of firms, number one. And number two, households will not just discuss what they're going to consume, but how they are going to spend their time, either working or not working, leisure. So we're done with the firms, we're done with households. Together, you have to write down those optimization problems and then put them together here with a financial intermediary, which sort of connects the firms and the households. Okay. So let's read. In this model, there is a financial intermediary, i.e., a bank, operating in the background. The bank intermediates between households, and the households are the ones who save, okay, or borrow via S, and the firm which needs funding for its capital investment. Okay. How so let me stop here. While it says here na we can borrow and save via S, in equilibrium here, guys, the people who are borrowing are the firms because the firms will borrow for its capital investment. Okay. And then households are the ones who will save and earn an interest based on that. Okay. Next, dadaan yan sa banko or sa financial intermediary. Okay? And then the bank will do the following. It will take funds from the household and then lend them to the firm B. Okay. So this sentence here essentially repeats what I just said. That the households are the ones that are saving. Okay. And then the borrowers are the ones, the investors are the ones who are the firm, right? Now, having said that, see household and see firm, I should say, see firm is actually ultimately headed or owned by the household. Okay. The intermediary is also essentially owned by the household, and whatever profits the intermediary earns will ultimately go to the household. Okay. We will see, however, that the intermediary will not really earn anything. And you can see that immediately here in 12.66. Because notice that the R, in terms of the B, or the borrowing, okay, and then the R from the saving is the same. Okay. Well, let me just pause here. Let me pause here first. Okay, sorry. Thank you. I'm back. Okay, and I've also paused the recording and now I have resumed the recording. Can everyone hear me? Can you double check that?
Yes po.
Okay, salamat. Okay. Okay, so like we said, may financial intermediary. You can think of it as a bank. Okay. Now it will earn when it is lending and it has to pay out the savings, right? Of the household, yung interest earning ng household. So that's why here the dividends, which is essentially the profit of the bank, it's going to earn from what it's lending to businesses, yung RBI. And then this RS, this is what it is going to pay out to households who are saving. Now, the R here and the R there in the first and the second term, they're the same R. Okay. And because of what's called market clearing, the amount of saving has to be equal to the amount of borrowing. Okay. So therefore, and that's actually here, guys, B equals S. And we're gonna call B I or investment. Okay, because essentially it's investment. The firms are borrowing money in order to invest and increase capital stock. Okay, so ganun lang yan, guys. This will essentially be zero. So yung D capital I, which is the dividends from well, essentially, first, it's the profit of the banks. Second, the households will earn the IT plus one, but then this thing that they're earning, this dividend that they're earning, is essentially zero, because these two things will sum to zero, basically. Any questions on the financial intermediary? Yeah, go ahead.
So, paano po magsi-zero yung dividends?
Because yung B, nandito sa next line na to, sa 12.67, S equals B. This is coming from the fact that you have market clearing for savings and investment. Or essentially, I think it's better explained by saying the amount that people are saving, right, yung S, has to be the same as the amount people are borrowing. Okay, that's the same as market. That's what's called market clearing. And this is quantities. Huh? So if I save 100 pesos, someone out there has to spend the saving of 100 pesos on some sort of investment activity. Okay, so ito siya. So specifically, itong BI tsaka itong S are the same, and the R's are also the same. Now, in the real world and in more complicated models, the R that you earn from lending will be greater than the R from saving. Okay? So basically may profit ka from banks will have profit because of that difference in sa interest rate. But here in this case, they're the same interest rate, and therefore this will essentially be zero in equilibrium. Okay, dokie. So, eto siya ang financial intermediary. So, if you recall, there are firms, households, and the financial intermediary. All of them will come together and form this equilibrium of the macroeconomy. Okay? So, as in the endowment economy, the equilibrium is defined as a set of prices and allocations under which all agents are behaving optimally. That is, nasusunod yung mga first order conditions nilang lahat, which are the Euler equations and all the other optimization equations that we've already calculated. And also all markets simultaneously clear. Okay, the labor market, the savings and investment market, etc. So let's be specific about what that means, which is essentially what this part of the chapter is all about. Agents behaving optimally means the household behaves according to a consumption function, okay, and to a labor supply function, which both of which we've calculated. Okay. The firm produces output according to a production function and demands labor and seeks investment according to those equations. The demand for labor and the demand for capital essentially will determine investment. Okay. So the equation numbers are all here, guys. You can just click on it and it will go back to those equation numbers. Meron ka ring market clearing, okay, which is here. sa savings must equal bonds borrowed equals investment. Or savings equals investment. Okay. Next, if this is combined with a household's period T budget constraint and the definition of period T dividends, one gets an aggregate resource constraint which looks similar to the expenditure definition of GDP, which happens to be Y equals C plus I. Okay, so if you recall, wala pang government expenditure dito, wala pang government sector. So basically, Y equals C plus I pa lang tayo. Which, by the way, if you go back to Solo, is basically also the equation to Solo. In Solo, if you produce Y, you can either consume it, or you can save it or invest it. It's the same as this one. Okay. I would, however, like to, because of it's more involved now because of the firms and the households and the financial intermediaries. So I want to present to you exactly how this is, how this can be done. Okay. So I will go to my PowerPoint, just here. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. So this is the one on top is the period T derivation, right? And what the book is saying, coming from here, this happens to be the first period constraint of the households. Once you apply the definition of dividends, and once you apply the savings equals B, right? Equals I, it will become Y equals C plus I. Okay. So this should be very, very clear, right? But I just wanted to remind you of this one. This dividends definition comes from the firms section of the chapter. And basically, yung sinasabi nito, guys, is, ano, since the household owns the firms, Y minus the labor cost here is equal essentially to operating profit. And all of that operating profit goes back to the owner. And who is the owner of the firm, guys?
Household.
The household. That's why you have the same D here. Source of income ng household yun, which is coming from this one, which is the definition of the dividends of the firm naman. And recall that the firm is maximizing these dividends also. Sa household, they're earning from dividends, which are coming from the firms, and they're also earning from the WNT. Pero papansin nyo guys, if you substitute the definition of D here, mawawala yung WNT. Di ba? Kasi it's gonna be WNT plus Y minus WN sub T. So the W and N, they cancel out. And what will remain basically is Y na lang. So the whole right-hand side will just be Y. You can actually end there. Consumption plus saving equals Y, but you're also going to use the fact that saving is equal to investment is equal to the borrowing of firms, and therefore S here will equal I also. So that's how you get that derivation. Okay, ganun lang kasimple. So the period T derivation is very simple, and it comes from these equations. By the way, these equations are all coming from the same chapter, chapter 14. You just grab the equations. Actually, kinopy-paste ko lang siya. Okay, but it's clearer to see everything once nakasulat lahat. Any questions about how the y is equal to sorry, y equals c plus I is derived? Go ahead.
So, bale, repeating what you said, nangyari siya from yung DT, yung D sub
Mhm.
T, pinalitan siya ng YT minus WTNT. So, nangyari,
Exactly.
na-cancel out lang yung WTNT. And then yung ST naman, ginawa siyang IT. So, kaya siya napunta sa Y equals C
Brilliant.
plus I.
Exactly, Chris. That's it. That's it. Exactly. That's it. Tama ka. Okay na? Okay na? Yeah. So you're exactly correct, sir. That's exactly it. And ganun lang siya kasimple. Right? Ganun lang siya kasimple. Slightly more involved, however, is the T plus one aggregate resource. By the way, this is called an aggregate resource constraint. Okay, and this is like a macro aggregate resource constraint. It just says that total GDP is going to be equal to consumption plus investment. The trick is that you have to show it every period. Okay, so here This is going to be true. Y equals C plus I. Now that the next step is you have to show it for T plus 1. So in T plus 1, total GDP in T plus 1 should also equal consumption in T plus 1 and investment in T plus 1. So the trick is how do you show it, correct? Because the period T plus 1 constraints are slightly more involved. Okay. So here is the T plus 1 constraint, essentially, but this time focused on consumption, right? And what do we know about this one, right? We know that consumption in time T plus 1 comes from yung mga sources of income, labor income, ito yung WN. And then what if you save, this is going to be a positive number, 1 plus RS, right? And then you're going to earn D, and D happens to be the future version of this thing, which is not the same form. It's here, actually. The future D is here. And then DIT plus 1, right? Having said that, we know that si D sub superscript I will become 0 in the end. So you can pretend that this goes away because by definition, that's this one, and this one will become equal to 0. This big D is not 0 because this is coming from the firms. This is essentially the profit of the firm in period 2. Okay, so mas complicated na siya because now you've got your output in period 2 plus whatever capital that's left. And remember, wala ka nang use for this. It's a two-period model. Recall what we talked about here. This is like a fire sale. This is like you produced, and then every capital that you're using, you're gonna sell off. Okay? That's why income siya. And then yung bayarin ng firm is labor, which is this. And meron pa siyang babayaran na utang. Right? Remember that he borrowed B in the past, and now you have to pay it off in full in the second period. So hopefully this is a review. This is coming essentially from the firm model that we talked about last week. Now, if you substitute itong dt plus 1 here, right? Itong dt plus 1 is just this dt plus 1. This d superscript I is just this one, etc. And once you substitute that into here, it becomes this guy, medyo mahaba. Okay. So by the way, this is the only reason why macro becomes tougher because the equations just become longer. But ultimately they're all linear. It's literally this plus this plus this plus this. So it's going to be very much fairly easy, right? Okay, so next is once you've simplified things and then some things become 0, right? Notice I didn't actually turn it into 0. You added the RBI and the RS here, right? You added that stuff, then you simplify things further. Pansinin nyo that the W N will also cancel the WN here, right? There's a positive labor income, and then there's a negative labor income here. It's negative here because these are dividends coming from the firm, and then this is the earnings from the household. So essentially it's a wash, right? And once you cancel everything and you are reminded by the fact that yung investment mo in time t plus 1 is also this guy here, which is the negative version of this is your investment. Okay. Again, I invite you to go back to the firm chapter to remind you of that. The reason why the investment is negative this is because wala ka nang gustong i-invest, right? In the future. Gusto mo nilang siyang ibenta. So that's why you can consider this as a sort of negative investment. Now, if you do that, then it's going to be yt plus 1 equals ct plus 1 plus it plus 1, which is essentially, again, the aggregate resource constraint. Y equals c plus I. Okay. Having said that, super easy. Where are we? Here. Okay. And you end up with y equals c plus I here. Now, our model, guys, essentially can be boiled down into these equations. And again, this is something that you have to bring to the exam, okay? And you have to know how these are, where these come from. Consumption function, that's the first equation here. That comes from the households optimization, okay? Next is, this is the NS or what do you call this one? If it's NS, it's called N is labor, right? But if there's an S, it's and you can contrast that to D. Notice that they're both labor. May isang S tsaka may isang D. What does that S mean and what does the D mean?
Labor demand and supply po.
Correct. Labor demand and labor supply. Exactly. And then I basically is essentially your demand for in capital. So that's your investment function here. And this is coming from the firm level decision of how much capital that they want. But it's also coming from what's called the law of motion for capital. So this is actually not a straightforward demand for capital. This is also includes the law of motion for capital. And then you have the production function, and then you have the aggregate resource constraint here. So how many equations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 equations, 6 endogenous variables. W, R, C, I, N, and Y. A plus AT plus 1, theta T, and KTR exogenous. YT plus 1 is a future endogenous variable. Okay. Meaning it's determined by your decision to save today. That's why it's a future endogenous variable. Any questions? Okay. So if you notice, we're building up the macroeconomy. First, y equals c, di ba? And then y equals c plus I. So may firm ka na. The firms are basically investing, and that's why now there's a positive saving by households, which are lent out to the firms. Now, this is actually super simple, this chapter 13. It's fiscal policy. There is a government in the macroeconomy, and in the government's job is to provide public goods. Okay. Hopefully you'll know what public goods are. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular class. But they're just goods that are provided by the government, which are non-exclusionary in nature. Okay. And here's the definition of that. And an example is military defense. Okay. We will assume that the government can finance its expenditure with a mix of taxes and debt. We will assume that taxes are lump sum in the sense that the amount of tax an agent pays is independent of any actions taken by the agent. Okay. Okay. This is an unrealistic description, but nevertheless, it simplifies the analysis and will provide some insights as to the relationship of the private sector, the households, and the firms to the government. Okay. So the government here also lasts 2 periods, T and T plus 1, same as the household, same as the firms. The government does an exogenous amount of expenditure, GT and GT plus 1. Okay. So this GT and GT plus 1, you can think about this as like fiscal policy. Okay. The government is trying to set GT and GT plus 1. As noted above, we do not model the usefulness of this expenditure, nor do we endogenize the government's choice of the expenditure, which are things that people have done, okay, and something that can be done also, if you wish. And it's definitely a central area of research, what determines G and GT plus 1. The government, whatever the G is, will face a budget constraint similar to a household. So this is G, diba? Yung gastos ng government should be less than or equal to what it receives in taxes plus its borrowings. So BG is positive if it's debt or borrowing. So that's the difference in terms of the sign conventions. A positive BG means that the government is borrowing. And if the government is borrowing, it's able to spend more. Okay? Kasi mas malaki yung right-hand side, the sources of funds. The second period, though, in the second period, there are now two uses of funds. Whatever spending that you want to do. And what do you think this is? RTBG. What's this second use of the money in period T plus 1?
future government borrowing. Oh,
So,
interest rate ng...
hindi siya future kasi T siya man, di ba? T. So,
Ah,
the past, actually. Ito yung hiniram mo before. Pero, what's happening here? Why are you spending money on this? Simple lang to, guys. Pag humiram ka before, anong mangyayari sa'yo ngayon?
You pay back the interest.
Bingo, you just pay it back. So that's why you have RT here. That's the interest rate times the amount that you borrowed. Okay? So dalawa lang yung panggagamitan mo ng pera. Actually, may third. Kasi see this BG here? Notice how it's negative? You can actually bring this to the other side. And this one will become 1 plus RBG. Right? So this essentially says that the uses of funds essentially are GT, and to pay for the original loan, okay, pay for the original loan plus interest. You can think of it that way. Pero itong negative BG pupunta sa other side. Now, the reason why pumunta siya dito is for intuitive kwento reasons. Why? The right-hand side then, you can interpret this right-hand side as your income comes from yung taxes mo for that period, plus any additional borrowings. This is the change in borrowings, right? So kung gusto mong gumastos on top of T plus 1, taxes T plus 1, you have to borrow more than before. So that's what this is saying. You have to borrow more from before. So that's why it's the difference between BG and minus BG T. Okay. BGT plus 1 minus BGT. So hopefully everyone got these two. Very, very simple budget constraint. It's similar actually to the household. Sa household is S. And the sign convention is the opposite. Sa household, S positive means saving. Dito, B positive means debt. It's the opposite sign. What I just said is basically here in this paragraph. Okay. Now, there's going to be an intertemporal budget constraint also for the government, and perhaps this is the important one that you should all remember. So these two budget constraints here, 13.1 and 13.2, you can put them together and get this. This one, 13.3, has the same interpretation as the household intertemporal budget constraint. Diba? Meaning that the present value of your spending, the left side, has to be equal to the present value of your income, the right-hand side. Okay? That the government has to sort of respect this intertemporal budget constraint. Diba? However, this intertemporal budget constraint includes the possibility of debt. Diba? Meaning it's not necessary na si GT is the same as taxes in time T. So as a quick, making sure that you understand, if the government wants to spend more than their revenue in time T, the government needs to what? If GT is bigger than TT, that means the government is blank. Doing what? Can they spend more than they earn? That's my question. In any given period.
Only by borrowing po.
Exactly. Pero it can, right? It can borrow. The only real constraint, Charles, is yung over its entire lifetime, in this case, very, very short lang ang lifetime niya. 2 periods lang. Over its entire lifetime, the present value of expenditure has to be equal to the present value of income. But other than that, especially in the first period, GT can be bigger than T, right? Because in that case, hihiram siya ng pera. And yung hindi mo nakikita dito sa intertemporal budget constraint is the saving or the borrowing, the BG in this case. Okay. So now we talk about the endowment economy. Endowment economy, again, is when the Ys are given or they're exogenous. Here is the revised household budget constraint. So revised siya because who pays for government expenditure? Yeah, who funds taxes? It's the households. So here you have the first period constraint for the households. They can consume, they can spend their money, and their total money is Y, whatever their endowment Y is. But then you have to subtract T. Diba? Yung magagastos lang nila is ano, yung Y minus T. In say ManQ or in 101, we said that Y minus T is called disposable income. Another way to think about this, guys, is if pag linipat niyo yung T sa other side, then it becomes a straightforward, sources of income, uses of income, right? Pag linipat mo yung T sa kaliwa, then your total income is just one, the endowment, YT. Then you have three uses for it: consumption, saving, and paying the government. So next period, it's the same second period, second period constraint for the household, except that now you have taxes in the future here. So now you have to subtract it out. Otherwise, this is the standard consumer or household budget constraint. And therefore, you can now write it as the new intertemporal budget constraint, see 3.6. So 13.6, I should say. 13.6 is the intertemporal budget constraint for the household with taxes. But it has the same interpretation. The left-hand side, present value of consumption for the household. On the right-hand side, present value of disposable income. Okay. We can also rewrite 13.6 as 13.8. It's even super clear, right? Look at this. The disposal. The present value of consumption equals the present value of your income, your endowment income. But then here you have to subtract what? What do you call this? The present value of? Okay. Whatever this is, based on the intertemporal budget constraint ng government, which happens to be this one, every time you see this t plus 1 over 1 plus r, you can just replace it with this one. So what will happen here, guys, is from 13.8, it goes to 13.9, and you're just replacing the t's with this g. Now, can someone tell me what this means in words? What is GT plus 1 over RT?
Present value of government spending.
Exactly, the present value of government spending. Okay, great. So everything is almost the same as in the household endowment economy that we studied before, right? Except that now meron kang mina-minus na either the present value of government expenditure or the present value of taxes because they have to be equal, right, at the end of the day. 13.10 is just a rewriting of 13.9, which is just y minus g. You can also think of this as disposable income. And then here is now your household budget line. And your household budget line basically is the same as the one in chapter 9, I want to say. But now you have a minus g here, then a minus gt, then a minus g, then a minus gt here. And the slope is still 1 plus r. Okay, so it's the same, except that the intercepts are now different, and it has to reflect the fact that there's a g. Okay. Here's your consumption function. Note that if you're a fan of the 101, right, the consumption function of ManQ, this is essentially the same, except that here we have chosen to write it as disposable income out of government spending today and in the future. And then now here you have R, which is a negatively related to current consumption because of the thing that we studied in chapter 9, which is substitution effect is greater than the income effect no matter what. Next, market clearing requires BG equals S, right? In other words, the household saving must equal government borrowing. Okay. Equivalently, household borrowing must equal government saving. From 13.1, we have BG equals G minus T. You substitute this for S into 13.4 and it yields the following. Y, or GDP, this is government, this is just an endowment, this is just a number, equals consumption plus government or public consumption. Okay, so nawala dito guys yung I because we are not considering a production economy yet. So this is just an endowment economy. And the endowment economy, yung endowment mo na Y can either go into what's called private consumption or government consumption. So that's 13.2. Okay. Now, equations 13.12 and 13.11 characterize the endowment of the equilibrium of the economy. This is two equations, C and R. YT plus 1G, and GT plus 1 are all exogenous. TT plus 1, and BG do not appear at all in the equilibrium conditions, which are 13.12 and 13.11. Right? You confirm that. Right? Now it's in G only, G, and then G is here, right? Consumption and the aggregate resource constraint here. Okay. What else? Yes. This means that these variables are irrelevant for the determination of equilibrium, prices, and quantities, right? C and R. This does not mean that fiscal policy is irrelevant. G and GT plus 1 are going to be relevant for equilibrium quantities and prices. But taxes and debt are irrelevant. Okay. So this is the important conceptual point of the chapter. Okay. And first, before going into this, you have to convince yourself of this, right? The only thing that's crucial, because the only variables in your model are Y, G, C, R. Walang T and walang BG, or debt. Okay, and that's the source of the Ricardian equivalence here. That the things that are important to consider, right, are just GT and GT plus 1. And this is called Ricardian equivalence. This hypothesis was revived in its modern form by Robert Barrow in a series of papers. The gist is the method of government finance is irrelevant for understanding the effects of changes in government expenditure. Okay, put differently, a change in GT will have the same effect on the equilibrium of the economy, whether it is financed by an increase in taxes, by increasing debt, or some combination of the two. Okay. So it's irrelevant if it's coming from debt or if it's coming from taxes. The only thing that's important is ultimately, well, what's important is that the intertemporal budget constraint is ultimately followed, which is the present value of government spending equals the present value of taxes. Okay, but whether or not all of the GT, the current GT, involved some debt or borrowing or not, okay, doesn't really matter. Okay. Corollaries are that the level of government debt is irrelevant for understanding the equilibrium behavior of the economy, and that changes in taxes, not met by changes in either current or future government spending, will have no effect on the equilibrium of the economy. So here's some intuition, and I think this is one of the most important paragraphs here in this chapter. Okay. Okay, just responding to a text. Got it. All right, then the intuition for Ricardian equivalence can be understood as follows. Suppose that the government increases GT by issuing debt with no changes in taxes, right? So how did you finance GT in this case? You issued debt. Okay. This issuance of debt necessitates an increase in future taxes in an amount equal in present value to the current increase in spending. Since all the household cares about is the present discounted value of tax obligations, The household is indifferent to whether the tax is paid in the present versus the future, so long as the present value are the same. The only thing that they care about is the present value of total expenditure or total tax payments. In other words, from the household's perspective, it is as if the government increases the tax in the present by an amount equal to the change in spending. Even though they borrowed money, nag-issue sila ng debt, people will think or believe or act as if it was a tax financed increase in government spending anyway. Furthermore, suppose that the government cuts taxes in the present with no announced change in current and future spending. For the government's intertemporal budget constraint to hold, this will necessitate an increase in future tax by an amount equal to present value to the decrease in current taxes. Again, all the household cares about is the present discounted value of tax obligations. The cut in T sub T is irrelevant for the household's behavior because it believes that in the future, tataas dapat yung taxes. And ultimately, it will be the same present value of taxes. Finally, government debt is irrelevant. So suppose that the government issues a positive debt, BG, greater than 0. This is held by the household with S greater than 0. This stock of savings held by the household is not wealth for the household. So why not? The household will have to pay higher future taxes to pay off this debt. Okay? Because in order to pay off the debt, kailangan tumaas yun yung tax in the future. In essence, the household will pay itself the principal plus interest on the outstanding debt in the future through the government in an amount equal in present value to the household's current stock of savings. So ultimately, what's important here, it turns out, is the entire present value of government earnings. So whether or not in the current day it's financed by a T or by a BG, because as long as there's no change in the total or the present value of total expenditures or taxes, I should say, then there's no change in C, which is consumption. Okay. So in this paragraph, we have a bunch of warnings. The Ricardian equivalence is stark. It means that level of government debt is irrelevant, that tax-financed government spending changes have the same equilibrium effects as deficit-financed changes in spending. Does Ricardian equivalence hold in the real world? Likely not. So there's only special cases in which it holds, including the case here that we're talking about. Taxes are lump sum, i.e. additive, right? So which is true here, because literally your disposable income is just your income minus the tax. So that's called a lump sum tax. You're just subtracting a total amount. If the amount of the tax a household pay depends on the actions that they take, right? Which is normally the case. So for example, if the amount of taxes you pay depends on how much you consume, then Ricardian equivalence won't hold exactly, right? Second, Ricardian equivalence requires that there be no liquidity constraints, that households are able to freely borrow and save at the same rate of the government. Third, Ricardian equivalence requires that households are forward-looking and believe that the government's intertemporal budget constraint must hold. Okay. Fourth, a Ricardian equivalence requires that the government and household have the same lifespan. If the government outlives households, then the timing of tax collection will matter to consumption and the saving decisions of households. Okay, so that's it's this fourth one is actually a crucial part of the explanation or the intuition of this particular model. That the households in our model here are two-period households, and the government also lives in the same two periods. Okay, and that's why the only thing that matters is the total or present value of government taxes. It's because they exactly have the same lifespan, right? Okay, and they live in this exact same period of time. Now, none of these conditions are likely to hold in the real world. Nevertheless, the insights from the Ricardian equivalence are useful to keep in mind when thinking about fiscal policy. Next is chapter or part 13.2.1. Okay, so which should remind you of Econ 101. Okay, because we're going back to the IS curve and we're saying here, so in 13.3, This is essentially your expenditure or planned expenditure. And it's going to be equal to, well, it's actually, this is not planned expenditure. This is called autonomous expenditure. This is autonomous expenditure. That means YT is equal to 0, right? So this is, you can consider this as the intercept of the planned expenditure because look, Y is 0 here. Kaya negative GT lang siya. So this is your total autonomous expenditure E0. If you notice, your GT and GT plus 1 will affect the position of the autonomous expenditure E0. Specifically, it can either go up or an increase in GT will raise autonomous expenditure in time T. Okay. I think yung kulang dito, guys, is dapat may E0T dito because it's autonomous, meaning it's the level of expenditure when income is 0, right? But it's the autonomous expenditure at time T. So that's this guy here, right? That's this one. That's the intercept here. Specifically, it's the one here, right? Now, what happens if you increase G? It's going to shift up the line, which should be familiar because this should be the Keynesian cross, right? And if you shift up the line here, you're going to shift the IS curve to the right, okay? Which is, again, something that should be familiar from your Econ 101 days, right? It will shift the IS curve to the right. What's happening in the bottom picture? And again, this should be familiar to you coming from, I think, chapter 11, which we talked about this. Here's the IS curve, but the equilibrium Y and R comes from the fact that the IS curve has to intersect what's called YS, or the supply, essentially, the total supply. And the total supply is coming from, because this is an endowment economy, YS is just some number, right? Total supply in time T. Okay, YT. So that has to be here. And these two lines will give you the equilibrium real interest rate R. All right. Another thing I guess I should point out here, and please give this a more thorough reading, is since we denote by partial CD, okay, this is consumption, partial CD, partial GT by MPC, which is less than 1, okay, this partial E, partial G, okay, this derivative works out to be 1 minus MPC. Okay? Hence, autonomous expenditure increases when government spending increases, but by less than the increase in government spending. Okay. This shifts the vertical axis intercept of the expenditure line up, okay, but by less than the change in government spending. Okay. This one, and I'll refer this to you to read, this picture is all about an increase in GT plus 1. Okay. In this particular case, the PE line or the expenditure line will shift down, and it will shift the IS curve from the black line to the blue line here, which will lower the equilibrium real interest rate in equilibrium. In 13.2.2, this is an algebraic example. Okay. So this is some guidance again for the future. Whenever you're dealing with models, you have to do it algebraically and you have to do it with graphs. Okay. So here's the Euler equation, which should give you, when combined with the intertemporal budget constraint, okay, it's gonna give you a production function, a consumption function, I should say. And then once you incorporate the consumption function, it now will give you this IS curve here, right? Which is the relationship between Y and R, and also now includes G as variables that will shift the IS curve around. Okay. And from 13.9, it's clear that an increase in GT raises RT plus 1, while an increase in GT plus 1 will lower RT. Now, finally, we will go to the fiscal policy and the production economy. So the reason why I'm confident that this one will end very quickly is number one, most of this follows the derivations in chapter 12. And second, the logic of the endowment economy in 12 and 13.2 and 13.1 basically follow 13.3, right? Everything that we learned before will apply here. Again, just to remind everyone, 13.2, 20, 13.21, these are just the household constraints. The only thing that has changed is the minus t plus 1, which is super similar to the endowment economy, right? This is an endowment. Sorry, this is not an endowment. This is a lump sum tax that you're taking out from the households. Now you've got your intertemporal budget constraint, and 13.24 is basically the version of the intertemporal budget constraint, but now with a production economy in mind. Slightly more complicated siya, okay? But essentially, guys, it's the same thing. You are subtracting G here, and then you're subtracting GT plus 1 here, which is, if you go back, just want to make sure everyone saw the connection. That minus GT and minus GT plus 1, that's just 13.9. That's just this one, right? Or actually, it's closer to this one, right? 13.10. So parehong-pareho lang siya dun sa endowment economy, except that now you've got a bunch of things like your labor income, your dividends from the financial intermediary, etc. Right? But other than that, it's the same as the endowment economy. And like the endowment economy, notice that these three Euler equations, not Euler equation, these three first order conditions, they're the same as in chapter 12, right? The Euler, the labor, etc., etc. You will then have consumption, which is the same as the consumption function as the endowment economy. It's going to be yt minus g, and then yt plus 1 minus gt plus 1. It's the same, right? Doesn't really matter if it's production or endowment economy. Then you have labor supply, which comes from the production economy side, right? The labor demand, your investment which comes from the firm decision as well as the law of motion per capital. Again, this is all coming from chapter 12, which we had just concluded. And finally, we'll have this C plus I plus G minus T, so it's G minus T actually, equals WN minus T plus D. Okay, so this is the first period budget constraint for the household. So now, if you notice, the dividend is basically this one, right? So it's essentially the same as this derivation that we did here, right? Except that now we have a bunch of G's. Except now that there's a bunch of G's and T's. G's and T's and then T's. So once you're able to do that, notice that you're going to get rid of the T's, okay? And then everything will simplify to Y equals C plus I plus G. And this is the aggregate resource constraint for the production economy, which exactly is the aggregate resource constraint that you've been learning since 101, right? The total GDP is just equal to what? Consumption, investment, and government expenditure. And now your total or your full model is the following, right? But now you've got government spending here, G. Okay. So notice that what happened, by the way, why don't we have to explicitly write down the budget constraint for the government? Yung mga budget constraint, yung mga budget line ng government, right? The whole what did we not have to write down? We didn't have to write down, just to put a fine point on it. We did not have to, as part of our model, we never had to write this down. Okay? The reason why we don't have to write this down is because it's fully incorporated into the household problem. Because the household already incorporates that by substituting the G from the T up here. Okay. In the same way, it's also true for the production side, and that's why in the production side of the economy, the model is just consumption function, labor supply, labor demand, investment demand, production function, and the aggregate resource constraint. The total expenditure of the government, present value, equaling the present value of taxes, that's all here already. That's all here in the consumption function. Okay. The households have already incorporated that information, which is again also another reason why the Ricardian equivalence exists, because the government, once the household incorporates that information, then the only thing that matters for the consumption of the government is not the change in G versus GT plus one, not the tax. It will matter. The G and the GT plus one will matter, but then how it's financed does not matter, because it doesn't matter if the G and the GT plus one comes from taxes or from debt. Okay, but of course the total GT and the GT plus one, both of these things will matter to consumption. And that's the end of the government section. The government section should be very straightforward, with one major conceptual issue, which is Ricardian equivalence. The logic of both the endowment and the production side is the same. Okay, so essentially it's the same arguments for either situation. For the exam, I would highly recommend that you do or understand both. But ultimately, guys, it's the same logic. So once you know or understand the endowment economy, and then once you understand the production economy, which we had just finished, then incorporating the government is very straightforward and easy. I will pause here and ask if there are any questions about chapter 13, because that's the government. Then next, on Tuesday, we'll be talking about chapter 14. And the end of chapter 14, I think we'll talk a little bit about chapter 15. But other than that, guys, this is the coverage for long exam 2. Once we're done with chapter 14, we're mainly or mostly done with the coverage of long exam 2. Monopolistic competition, we will push that to the final exam na, as well as the international macro part of the course. And a little bit of empirics, I hope. So I pause here if there are any questions. Also, the exam will be May 7. Okay. And it's exactly the same rules. Bring a blue book. Be prepared to answer essay questions, like explain what is Ricardian equivalence, explain what is MRT, what is MRS, etc. Right? And be prepared to do some graphing and algebraic solving of equations. Okay, if there are no questions, I guess I will now close the recording.